Second comment to my friend, Mr. Rosendale. May I comment on his
Please do,
remarks?
you're recognized.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm encouraged and inspired by the passion of you and many members that it is discipline and political will ultimately that must prevail in order for us to turn the tide of this deluge of debt that's going to bankrupt the country, to put it mildly and succinctly. I would say there is one big advantage of a debt commission that is bipartisan, and here's what it is. I don't think there's enough pressure from the electorate in any district, in any part of this country, on Democrats and Republican members to come up here and follow through on what they say they're going to do with respect to spending and the debt. If we can have bipartisan agreement on the numbers and the projections, and we can sound the alarm together and have a national campaign that wakes everybody up to this, as Abraham Lincoln said, without public sentiment, you can do nothing. With it, you can do anything. We need more pressure from the citizens of our country on the knuckleheads here in Congress that just apparently live in a different world altogether. So I see education and awareness as a valuable outcome of a bipartisan commission. But you're right, ultimately, got to have the political courage. I thank you for your input.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Rosedale, would you like to sit behind this a little bit longer?
You just want to use my chart.
The chair will now recognize Mr. Good from the great state of Virginia. My friend, Mr. Good, you are recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our committee for holding this opportunity for members to come and talk about one of the, I would suggest, two greatest threats to our country, along with our open border. We all know that the budget process has been broken for a long time, and the American people are suffering the consequences. The days of no consequence spending are long over, with record inflation, 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates, gas prices, grocery prices, housing prices, utility prices, just breaking regular income Americans. Congress has not, unfortunately, demonstrated the intestinal fortitude to approach the budget with the necessary resolve to cut spending, to rein in the bureaucratic state, or remain accountable to the established budget process, let alone think about addressing the mandatory spending disaster on the horizon. I find it just very interesting. So many of our members in the Republican conference even will say, gosh, it's not the discretionary, it's the mandatory. We got to go after the mandatory. And they don't have a willingness to deal with the discretionary, to earn the right, quite frankly, to reform mandatory spending. Currently, the national debt, we all know this, is at a historic high at $34 trillion, which equates to $260,000 per taxpayer, $100,000 per citizen. Interest on the debt has doubled under Biden, totaling $663 billion this past fiscal year. By 2027, it's projected interest payments on the debt are going to surpass defense spending. The national deficit this year is over $2 trillion. We're on track for a 12-month, $2.5 trillion. Worse, the Biden border crisis is costing us $150 billion annually on top of that, and yet assistance to Ukraine has topped $113 billion with no oversight for that, and we've got the president and the Senate Majority Leader asking for another $60 billion for Ukraine, and they don't want us to pay for it or have any offsets for that. You would hope that no Republicans, Mr. Chairman, would support supplementals without offsets, because that would demonstrate that the Republican conference, the Republican majority, doesn't take serious the greatest fiscal crisis we've ever faced that we're under right now. Democrats broke the bank last Congress by spending over $550 billion in the name of environmental justice. And the president continues to ignore the established process of checks and balances by putting forth 850 executive actions which have allowed his administration to unilaterally enact $1.5 trillion in additional spending. Congress must approach the budget process reform with a commitment to cut spending, a demonstrated commitment to do so. A couple of suggestions I would offer: my nickel plan, which should be included as a guiding principle for the budget process because it requires the federal government to reduce its budget by 1 nickel for every dollar that it spends annually, and it would balance the budget in 5 years. This upfront cut would allow the budget process to address the excessive spending enacted by prior Congresses. My Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act would help Congress account for and address the out-of-control bureaucratic state. It's nearly impossible to balance the budget when unelected bureaucrats issue costly rules and spend money without proper oversight. For this reason, the budget process must include a framework, like my bill, again, the Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, that would require a regulatory budget detailing regulatory costs similar to the annual budget for taxes and government spending. It would ensure that all bureaucratic spending is accounted for in any future budget process. This tool would allow those working on the budget to have a comprehensive understanding of all federal spending, not just that which is enacted through regular order. Some additional reforms. The budget process should ensure that if a budget's not passed by April 1, then Congress is required to remain in D.C. until the job is done. We ought to also not allow the president to give a State of the Union address unless he's done his budget as required by the first Monday in February. We ought to change the requirement for the Congressional budget resolution to include requiring a 10-year debt service projection. You know, how are we going to balance the budget or effectively address the budget process if the debt payments are not adequately accounted for? We need to change the requirement of the Congressional budget resolution to include a baseline and a target debt to GDP ratio. What's acceptable? What is our target there? And change the requirements of the Congressional budget resolution to require a markup of the budget within 2 months of the president's budget being published. I'm proud of the work that our chairman and our committee has tried to do on this issue. I think that a debt commission is a good thing to do, but it's only as strong or as valid as the willingness of Congress to enact the reforms that we all know are needed. This is not easy, but it's also not complicated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. I certainly appreciate not only your friendship, but also our shared passion for restoring fiscal responsibility to the nation's capital.